So our next speaker is Liam Curren. He is Head of Data, Compliance and Legal at Genomics PLC, which specialises in providing market-leading insights into human health based on sophisticated analyses of genetic and associated health data. He's also a solicitor with substantial IP experience, and he's worked here at Oxford as an academic researching data, law and privacy. And he's going to speak to us today about doing business with data.
Right, thank you very much indeed for inviting me along. Unlike, I think, most people here, I've not been doing any research. I'm not going to be talking about the results of my research. I'm just going to be trotting through what I do on a day-to-day basis and hope that some of you might find it interesting. And I'm a lawyer, so I have to start with this. So the opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of me alone, and not necessarily those of my employer. Although I try and get my opinions, turned into decisions, but some people listen, some people don't. Right, here we are, Genomics PLC. We are a spin-out from the University of Oxford. We're just over 3 years old. The two main founders are Professors Peter Donnelly and Gil McVeigh, both very big names in the field of statistical genetics, both heads of rather prominent research institutes here in Oxford. And with them, we've combined, I think we number now 36, 37 people, the majority of whom are scientists and software engineers, and then there's a combination of people who once were scientists, like me, but have become lawyers and other such exciting professions. So what do? We get as much genetic data as we possibly can from everywhere that will let us have it. And a large part of my job is making sure that we get as much and we're doing it properly, we do things properly with it when we get it. So we think we've probably got the largest database of its kind in the world. One thing I have realised in this job over the past 2 or so years is it's very hard to describe what your database is, how big it is and what it contains. There's probably a research project in just how you describe a database. It's difficult. Anyway, so what have we got? We have got thousands of GWAS studies, so genome-wide association studies, looking at genetic variants across the entirety of a human genome and seeing if any particular association might have relevance to any particular phenotype. We have data from loads of sources which amounts to millions of unique sort of actual people. We have data on millions of these variations, the SNPs, and we have data on thousands of what we describe as unique phenotypes. What we do, and what no one else does, is get this data, tidy it up, put it through rigorous QC processes, and we can just interrogate it again and again and again. The more data we get, the more powerful our interrogations are, and the more useful we think our results are. So we've got a big analytical platform. We've been developing this for the best part of 3 years. We think we can do a lot with it. We're already proving to some people we're working with that we can do a lot with it. I suppose I should say that the possibilities are limitless of what we could do with it, but here are just a few things. So biological target validation and prioritization, looking into things such as on-target safety issues relating to drugs, thinking about what genetic data might say about repositioning opportunities, target discovery, patient stratification, clinical trial design, optimization, etc., etc. There is real power in this data, and you get more out of this data by organizing it in the way that we have. So we are working with a lot of people because, thankfully, a lot of people are interested in the work that we're doing. In particular, we're working with a range of leading pharma companies, and we're doing a range of work for them, performing different types of analyses and giving them recommendations on their own R&D pipelines. We're also an analysis partner to Genomics England, the 100,000 Genomes project, and we work very closely. We're just coming towards the end of our work with them at the moment on the first project with their Gene Consortium. So this is their consortium of just over a dozen companies, most of them pharma companies. So we have had access to the Genomics England data, and we've been trying to show how powerful that is and could be. Interesting that UK Biobank was mentioned in the context of Genomics England as well. We have access to the UK Biobank data. It is amazing. It is the best resource of its kind in the world at the moment. It is utterly incredible. The potential for using that genetic and phenotypic data is just mind-blowingly good. We are doing a lot with it. Other people are doing a lot with it. I, for one, think that their model is spot on, and it allows us and other people like us to do the work that we want to do in a commercial setting. I think at the CPM event last year, Rory Collins was stood up here expressing some surprise that there weren't as many commercial people using UK Biobank data. We've been using it from the off. I think more people are, but it's incredible, and it's open to everyone. Anyone who's doing bona fide research into public health, public health benefits and all of that can get access to this, and it's effectively free. There's a quid pro quo which I'll come and talk about, but it is effectively free. So anyway, we work with data. One of the first things I was involved in when I joined the company is saying, well, key issues about working with data is being considered trustworthy. People, fine, we can say we're bona fide researchers, but what are the standards by which we work? This is a sort of slightly paraphrased list of a piece of paper that everyone signs on their first day of the company. There are various things in there which will strike a chord with people in the audience, I would hope, but the one thing that everyone in the company has to be aware of is that real people sat down, did tests, gave samples, data from that was generated, and we are lucky to be using it, but we've got to treat it particularly seriously. I'm not going to dwell on data protection or anything like that in this talk, but that obviously is of particular relevance here as well. So these are a few of the things I'm paid to worry about on a day-to-day basis at Genomics PLC. I find all of them pretty exciting, actually, which is quite good. These are the things I'm going to talk about today. So, do we have the necessary permissions to use data for our intended purposes? Is any form of data exclusivity achievable or appropriate? And are we protecting data and the technology that we develop using data? And just to be clear, when I say data in this context, big data is a big field, we are a big data company, but we're talking about this data. Human genetic data linked to one or many phenotypes. So typically, here's a genetic variant, it seems to be associated with this disease and that one and another one and so on and so forth. Most of the data we have is actually effectively anonymous. I know you can't be robust about claims of anonymity, but we have large amounts of aggregated data. It would be nigh on impossible to work out who a particular person was looking at that data and that data alone. We are not minded to try and re-identify people. There is no need to try and re-identify people. If we did try to re-identify people, we would probably be denied access in the first place. I think statements about the anonymization risk of aggregate data are massively overstated. I think they get in the way of research. I would commend that you all read a paper by Mark Daly on the Medium website. Mark Daly is a very esteemed scientist based in the US, and he puts the case for people getting a bit too carried away about risks of identifiability and summary statistics, aggregate data. I would commend that paper to you all. It does very much align with our company's way of doing things, but we have nothing to do with them. It's very good. Anyway, and a lot of the data we have is individual level. So UK Biobank, we have 500,000 people's worth of genotype data run on a particular chip showing a whole load of variants, and a massively deep and powerful amount of linked phenotypic data. So, do we have the necessary permissions to use data for our intended purposes? So, most of the data we have is available to everyone else. If you're a bona fide researcher, you have an interest in this data, you can go and get it. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes a bit of negotiation on occasion, but there's nothing sort of exclusive about that, and I think that's got to be right. The more people using data, mining it as a resource, as was talked about in one of the speakers mentioned earlier, the better for science, the better for healthcare. I come across a range of data access agreements, most of which are entirely straightforward and reasonable, some of which adopt odd approaches to how data should be dealt with. In other words, they want to keep hold of what we might do with the data, and that makes for some interesting negotiations. Nonetheless, our use of data should not block access of others to the same data. That's got to be the way that we work in this sector, because if people like us were to start taking data away and trying to block access to other people using that same data, then the sector, such as it is, gets smaller, less research is done, fewer results are made available, and fewer improvements. I do see things like Creative Commons licenses. They're obviously focused on copyright. Doesn't really work very well with data. Data and copyright, things tend to break down a bit there. I've seen more and more of these open database licenses, which I think is the sort of data equivalent of the Creative Commons. I've not really looked into how one might be related to the other. They're pretty good, I think. The more people who start using things like that, the easier it is for people like us to know what we're getting and know what we can do with data. I will come back to my aside, which is very much a personal opinion, at a later slide. Is any form of data exclusivity achievable or appropriate when we're getting data from all of these people? So exclusivity, goes without saying, in any form will give us some form of commercial advantage. We are a for-profit commercial company. We are looking for advantages wherever we can get them. People like 23andMe have paid to generate all of the data that they have. So they don't readily give it out to people. It's hard to argue with that because you don't have to be a 23andMe customer. You don't have to sign up to their terms. You don't actually have to participate. You have your data made available to the research done using 23andMe data if you do buy one of their kits. But I think the most recent stats said that 85% of their over 2 million customers happily make their data available for use for research. You can buy data from 23andMe because it's kind of that's part of their business model, right? We don't operate like that at the moment. We haven't paid to generate any data, so we rely on other people for data. Why not mention UK Biobanker here, again here? The quid pro quo is that we pay a small administration fee, same as everyone else does, to get access to the data. They expect us to publish. Publication is obviously not, well, companies need to publish in a slightly different way to academics, obviously. We will publish papers. We are working on papers with academics at the moment. And moreover, they expect the results of the work that we do, so results from the many GWASs that we might have done, to be fed back and returned to the biobank for use by other people who apply for access to the biobank. We are bound by those terms. We signed up to the same terms as everyone else did who wants to use UK Biobank data, and we will return the results in accordance with the material transfer agreement that the biobank has everybody sign up to. So to a degree, when we're talking about exclusivity, there's not much other than a time-limited period of exclusivity by which we and we alone will be sitting on results that aren't quite ready to be returned because we haven't finished work on the data, or we're still sort of going over them and improving the quality of them. But that's as close as we get to exclusivity. And I would say that this sort of pre-competitive view on the world is shared by more and more of the pharmaceutical sector in this particular context. We work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies who do share the view that this sort of, the initial results from genetic and phenotypic associations out there as results, just as results, should be there to be used by anyone. I personally think it's hard to argue against that. Are we protecting the data and technology we develop using the data? So we are not claiming ownership over data because it's a legal nonsense. You do see people who sometimes talk about ownership over data as if it is a settled piece of law and we do own data, we don't. It just doesn't get anyone anywhere, and actually you just end up treating data through common sense approaches, basically through contracts. And that works at the moment. I don't see any reason to try and fix that. I'll talk about that a bit more. We try and keep things secret as much as possible. We rely on trade secrets. We have a big lot of proprietary software and architecture that underpins our analytical platform, and we tend not to tell people how it works, because why should we? We are seeking to patent analytical technology wherever we can. So not only are we dealing with the murky issue of data, as I say in the next one, applications based on our in silico data. We're also dealing with software patents, which makes patents discussions with our patent attorneys very interesting. Why go for the easy areas to patent when you can go for two of the more difficult ones? And yeah, we have to balance our commercialization plans against the obligations for us to either publish and or return data to people who've given us the sort of raw source data in the first place. So patents aren't a big part of my working day. I don't get too bogged down about patents. We will seek to align the patent system where we think it is appropriate. I would say for most of the data we're getting, there seems to be more and more of a view that patents aren't the right thing to be getting involved with at this early stage. And I must stress, we typically work with people at a much earlier stage, the first steps into the valley of death, if you like. But yeah, as I see it, it's a bit of a distraction. So what of the future? Law has not recognised information as a form of property, at least not in English law. I felt compelled to put at least some case references in just to remind myself that I am a lawyer. There's no real sort of decent law on this. You've really just got a few judges saying a few things about information and property in a few cases. So data wasn't considered something that could be stolen, so therefore wasn't property. Data was ineligible for a common law lien. You couldn't hold something as property and say, I'll only give it back when you pay something. And other comments talk about there being no proprietary rights in the mere content of an email. I just think it's far too complicated, which is a rubbish reason for not trying to do something. But I think it's, the extent of data that we have, albeit most of it aggregated and most of it pseudonymized at best, pseudonymized or anonymized, it's just, I don't know. You couldn't have any form of exclusive right of ownership over data because it exists all over the place. I do wonder who could claim meaningful exclusivity over data relating to individuals in a healthcare context. People are using this data all over the place. They're using it as part of treatment. They're using it as part of the research that we and others like us do in the commercial and the academic sectors. It just doesn't feel right. That's my research. These are my research results. They're basically just sort of knee-jerk reactions from me. What's wrong with contracts and licenses? They work perfectly well, I think. People have data. We say, what are the terms upon which we can use this data? They send us a contract and say, you can use it for this, but not this. And we say, fine, that seems okay. We sign up to it. If we are in breach of the contract, there are well-trodden paths that people can take to try and right what went wrong. I think we are going to continue in the community making all of this pre-competitive data widely available. This genetic and associated phenotypic data is valuable for us and many other people. It should just be there for as many people to use as possible. As many responsible people to use as possible. And I would say that everyone is responsible. It's going to be interesting when the GDPR, the new European Data Protection Regulation, becomes law next May. It does give individuals more control over personal data. The bulk of the data we have will be pseudonymized data as far as the GDPR is concerned, which actually removes quite a few of the individual's rights to have control over their personal data. I mean, put simply, if Joe Bloggs knocked on our door and said, what data do you have about me, Genomics PLC? My name is Joe Bloggs. We would interrogate our database and platform and go, we have no idea. They would have to give us a whole load more data, like here's my date of birth, here's my postcode, here's whatever else. Only armed with that data would we be able to say, oh, fine, well, as it turns out, it seems you participated in a research project, we have this data about you. But us and others like us, provided we continue to act responsibly in how we deal with any form of sensitive data, regardless of its anonymity or otherwise, shouldn't be too badly affected by that. I say this as a company, we are accredited with ISO 27001. We take information security very seriously. That's another part of the sort of trustworthiness. Why should you give your data to us? Because we take it seriously, because we've got all these measures in place. So data protection is helpful, is really helpful, and I think much more useful ultimately than trying to craft a new legal right of owning data that is here, there and everywhere. That said, my sort of pessimism about this, I do wonder if there's some technological solutions that could, if more widely adopted, have some benefit here. I mean, there's a lot said about blockchain. It's one of the sort of, there's buzzwords at the moment. You have to say things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and use of the blockchain. If you don't talk about that in a healthcare context, you're not sort of looking forward enough. So I've said all three now, so I'm very forward-looking. But nonetheless, there are, these are immutable records of transactions of stuff. Now, healthcare data could be some of that stuff. You see articles quite frequently, or at least I do, about, oh, we've got this new blockchain healthcare application which is going to change the world. One of them might, so we should keep an eye on it. I would say that something that moves as quickly as blockchain is much more likely to have a decent and helpful effect than perhaps the law bringing up the rear 10 or 15 years afterwards. Not to say that it shouldn't, but I think things like that could help, and we'll just rely on standard principles of again contract and other established bits of law that can just sort of back up the use of a new technology like that. This is a sort of, it's a mini bugbear because the vast majority of people who we ask for data say, yes, absolutely, who are you, what do you do? We say we are Genomics PLC, we do this type of scientific research, we are scientists working in a commercial setting. But you do find some people, and it is a minority, who think that the commercial use of data, and I'm talking about the same data I've been talking about all the way along, just shouldn't be there for companies. It shouldn't be given to them, which as far as I can see from a brief scan of funders' terms, not all but most, many sort of leading journals' terms, they're in direct contravention of that, I think. There's no sort of there's nothing in those terms that I've seen, unless someone's put a sort of unhelpful non-commercial Creative Commons license on something without really thinking about it, that should stop bona fide scientists who happen to be working in the commercial sector having access to this data. The main reason why we shouldn't is because a consent form several years ago said, someone ticked a box saying, I don't want my data to be used for any commercial purposes. If that's the case, we simply can't argue against it. We're not minded or indeed resourced to go back and have people do a reconsenting exercise on tens or hundreds of thousands of people. But this seems to be a sort of nagging thing. The more we tell people about what we do, the more often it goes away. But every now and then you do see these sort of entrenched views about data and the sort of big bad pharma aspect of things. We work with pharma. We could become as big as a big bad pharma company. If it weren't for the big bad pharma companies, there would be no drugs on the market. I know they're not perfect, but they've got to start with something. We think that starting with the data we have is actually going to help them. We think that we can help them make better drugs more quickly and for less money, because the genetic data used at an early stage actually can save them loads of money. Don't focus on target A. The genetics suggest that target A isn't the right one for you, so focus on target B for this phenotype. You know, we're quite confident of our chances of giving good advice at that stage. But what I would say is that basically, you know, the wider public, I don't think they have a clue. I mean, fine, you've got 500,000 people who participate in UK Biobank. They're a bit more sort of in the know about all of this, and they will have expectations that people are going to go off and use their data. But you've only got to read some of the negative press about the shock and horror and people throwing their hands up that Google DeepMind had access to NHS data in the first place, in this Streams app that they're working with at the Royal Free Hospital in London, when actually they're absolutely entitled to apply to the NHS for data, provided they, you know, work within the permissions that the NHS puts on them. They and other people like them who are for-profit commercial companies, if they're doing the right type of research and treating the data with the right type of responsibility, they should have access to that data. But I think there's a slight worry, perhaps, of that I have, that there could be another sort of Frankenstein's food-style, uninformed press reaction to this. People need to understand a lot more about the data, and I really think the industry has a responsibility here. I mean, and obviously I include Genomics PLC in part of that. This data is really, really valuable and has the ability to make profound changes in healthcare if more people are allowed to use it. So I think there's a lot of good work going on here at the moment. I don't think it's had much traction, and I do think there's a risk of a bad news story getting in the way of some really good progress. That's just a sort of position that I will adopt by myself. And that actually was all I was going to talk about today. Very happy to take questions.